Hello and welcome to Immediate Immersion Live, where today we're talking about flipping the script on error corrections. If you're watching this live, please go ahead and type in hashtag live. And if you're watching this on the replay, type in hashtag replay. Remember, if you're watching live, you're welcome to post any questions or comments in the chat. And if you're watching on the replay, you've got the comments below the video, and I check back and answer all of them as we go along. Today, I'm going to show you that error correction hacks that not only work, but will keep your students engaged, motivated, and actually excited to learn from their mistakes. My name is Scott, and you're watching Immediate Immersion Live, where we're all about comprehension-based instruction in the modern language classroom. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. And welcome back. A couple of things housekeeping things I want to talk about before we get started. Let's see. We have our Beyond the Basics showing up here. Let's see if I can get the link up here. James has just said, I reward funny errors that are funny. Kids learn when they are laughing and maintain their effective filter by giving points instead of scolding. Absolutely, and I'll talk about that and address it in just a moment because that's a really good point. So we got our Beyond the Basics mini course coming up. It starts on Thursday of this week. We have a combination of Thursdays, Saturdays, and Sundays because we've got some holidays coming up. But it is 10 classes that we are talking about taking your CI practices to the next level. We're talking about advanced type CI things that aren't always talked about, some new strategies, some modifications of old strategies to make them updated. So if it's something that you're interested in, let me go ahead and put the link in the chat here. You can access it and register at it's mm.us/beyond. So if that's something you're interested in, all the classes are recorded if you can't watch them live, so you can always go back and you will have access for a full year to watch any of those replays along the way. So I just wanted to get that out for you if that's something that you're interested in. As I said, it's starting right away on Tuesday. But again, if you can't watch the classes live, you're welcome to watch on the replay. Now, before we get started, let's go ahead and go back to what James was talking about. There's a really funny error that happens a lot in Spanish. And if you're a Spanish teacher, you probably know what I'm going to be talking about. The kids mix up the word años, which for those who don't speak Spanish, we have two different N's. One has a little squiggly line on top, and that is pronounced like an N and a Y together. And then the regular N, which is just without the squiggly line, which is pronounced like normal. But if you misspell and forget that squiggly line, it can often change the meaning of the word. And años normally means years, comes from annual. But kids often forget that little squiggly mark, and that changes the meaning of the sentence completely. Just like in French, Spanish uses the word has when you're talking about age. So you say something like, tengo 15 años. I have 15 years. But when kids forget the little squiggly line, it's called tilde, on top of the N, it becomes tengo 15 años. Now, años means years. Años means anuses. So it makes for a funny sentence. So just like James says, we kind of make fun of this and laugh together. I had one kid many years ago now. It's been many years, beginning of my career. I knew he was 17, and on a test, we always took the time to go over the tests afterward. He had written 16 down instead of 17. And so when I called him on it, he's like, I know, I forgot how to say 17. I'm like, that's not the problem. And I walked over to my desk and I got out a hall pass and I wrote a pass to the nurse. I wrote emergency on it and I put his name on it and I handed it to him. And he's like, what is this for? And we're all laughing. And I'm like, because you have 16 anuses. That seems to be a medical problem, and you need to go see the nurse right away. And so we all started laughing and having a fun joke about it. And it was just a lighthearted way to point out the mistake. And then once kids knew about that, they either did one of two things. In high school, they avoided it like the plague. They didn't want to make that mistake anymore. But when I went to middle school teaching, they thought it was funny to say that they had, 11 or 12 or 13 anuses, even though they knew it was wrong. That's what they did. So both ways worked, but it was kind of a funny way to approach that particular error. And there's lots of other ones. I had another student, again, in the same school way back at the beginning of my career, who had trouble discerning between an A and an O in pronunciation. I'm not sure exactly why. Part of it was he mixed up the words, but also the pronunciation. And he would mix up hambre, which means hunger, and hombre, which means man. And in Spanish, just like in French, we aren't hungry. We don't use the verb to be with hungry. We use the verb to have. So the kid would always say, tengo hombre, which means I have a man, versus tengo hambre, which means I have hunger. And he was going on a Mexican cruise, and he says, I'm really excited to use my Spanish. And I says, good, it's going to be a great experience for you. I just said, but remember, it's tengo hambre at the restaurant. Tengo hambre, not tengo hombre. And he comes back, and he's laughing, and And I'm like, so how did your trip go? He goes, Profe, you warned me. You warned me not to say tengo hombre, but that's the first thing I said at a restaurant. And the waiter looked at me funny. So it's just having these fun things so that an error is not a stressful thing. It's not something that is to be punished for, but it's something we can all laugh at ourselves about. Makes it a much better experience. So thank you for pointing that out, James. That is awesome. Okay, let's go right on into our first topic here, and that is the use of gestures and visuals. So we all know how important nonverbal cues are. Body language is so important in the scheme of communication. We know this because we know no matter how good our language skills are or our students' language skills are, talking on the phone is a whole different experience than actually talking face to face. You don't realize how much that you rely upon body language until you are communicating on the phone where you don't have access to that body language. And sometimes some miscommunications can happen. I know for me, I always stress out having to call a parent in the target language. I'm always afraid there's going to be some kind of misconception along the way. And I usually don't do conversations with parents on the phone. I usually do email interaction, whether it be in English or Spanish or any other language, just so there's a written documentation of what was going on. But often, when one of our administrators needs to contact a parent, and we have our counselors speak Spanish, so that works if the counselor's available. But if they're not available, then they go to one of us Spanish teachers, and there are 4 of us at our school. And they would then ask us to call the parents for them on their behalf. And that always kind of puts a little bit of anxiety on me just because I don't have that body language to be able to rely upon. And usually what they're asking me to call upon is usually stuff about bad behavior, usually. Every once in a while it may be registration information, which is a lot less stressful. But with behavior issues, you can make missteps legally because there are certain legal things that you need to talk to parents about in a certain way so that you are following ed code and you're dotting all your I's and crossing all your T's. And so it's really stressful for me. I don't know about my fellow Spanish teachers. Well, actually, two of them are native speakers, so it's probably not a problem for them. But for the two of us who are not native speakers, I think our stress level goes up a little bit because the body language and nonverbal cues are so important in language. If that's something that you also find that nonverbal cues are really important, body language is important in communication, go ahead and put a 1, or let's change this up. If you also are less comfortable speaking in a language that's not your native language on the phone, go ahead and put in a 1 in the chat or in the comments if you're watching on the replay. And if you are very comfortable speaking in another language on the phone with no problem, without having any of that body language issues, go ahead and put in a 2, just so I can kind of see where things are going. And then we'll check back after the replays air and see how many we are getting there. But here's a strategy that you can use in your classroom to help with, correcting errors without putting the student down or making them feel uncomfortable about their errors. You can integrate simple gestures to signal the nature of the error. For example, you could tap your ear if they misunderstood something that was spoken, or you can point to a talking mouth for speaking errors. And this nonverbal approach can keep the vibe positive and the conversation flowing. And what's really important is to keep that conversation flowing. I often talk about my German teacher that I had in college. Frau Olsen was an amazing woman, amazing German teacher, and I learned so much from her. But one of the things that not only I experienced, but other people in the class, was she was a bit on the old school side. So as you were talking, especially like when we were talking about our weekends or one of those types of conversations, she would always interrupt our talking to point out our mistakes and correct us. And if you think adjective endings and gender are an issue in French or Spanish, you don't know anything until you get to German. German, there are 3 genders, and the endings change depending, like adjective endings, change depending on whether it's singular or plural, whether it's the subject of the sentence, the direct object of the sentence, the indirect object of the sentence, or if it's showing possession. But not only that, it also changes whether it follows a definite article or an indefinite article. So if it's followed by the, then it takes one set of endings depending on whether it's a subject, direct, indirect object, or a possessive. And then it's a whole different set of endings if it follows an indefinite article, whether it's a subject, indirect, direct object, or a possessive, and then whether it's singular or plural. So she would always correct you on those types of things, and it stopped the conversation from flowing, and it raised our affective filter. This was even before what I knew affective filter was. I just called it stress. It raised that stress and lowered the confidence level, and it made us all not want to speak as much out loud because she didn't make us feel bad about our errors. It was just an inherent feeling that we got when you got corrected. Just like anything, whenever you get corrected, you kind of feel badly. So the goal when you're having a conversation with your students is to keep the conversation flowing. And with that, you don't want to interrupt. And you can use nonverbal cues to help with that. James says, Spanish, Russian, French 1, I think that meant Mandarin, and Dutch 2. Awesome. That's a lot of languages, James. Now, here's some examples. So if a student incorrectly pronounces a word, instead of interrupting, simply repeat the word with the correct pronunciation while subtly gesturing towards your mouth. This reinforces the correct form without needing a verbal correction. You don't have to point out that it's wrong. So if a kid says, like using my años example, so they say años, I go, oh, tú tienes 17 años. Años. So I'm not really pointing out the error in an obvious way. I'm using a simple gesture to help with that. Or perhaps a kid makes a vocabulary error. They use the wrong word for something. So in that case, I can draw a simple picture. I always joke. People always are. There's some, like one of my teachers I work with, my French teacher. She's very self-conscious about her drawings, so she does not do any drawings in the classroom at all. I lean into that. So I tell them, I know none of you can be as good of an artist as I am. And then I draw these horrible stick figures up on the board, and it's kind of funny. So if a kid makes a mistake, and let's say they meant to say dog, but they say cat, then I will draw the word cat and then a picture of a cat next to it, and the word dog and a picture of a dog next to it in a stick figure, in a really horrible picture, but one that's obvious to tell the difference between which one is which. And so it's kind of a funny way to kind of point it out. And then I'm not pointing out an error. They're still talking. I'm just drawing my little picture up on the board. Or if I'm sitting at my computer and I'm projecting up on the board, I can quickly go to Google Images, and then I go ahead and search for what I'm looking for. But let me give you a word of warning about Google Images. I made this mistake many years ago when I had 6th graders in. It was so many years ago. So I just had started teaching middle school, and I had 6th graders, 11-year-olds, for the first time in my life. And I needed a picture of a fat cat. Now, I had safety check on Google. You know, you have that safety search on there, so bad things aren't supposed to show up. So I thought I was good. And so I've got 6th graders. I've got an old-fashioned projector projecting on a screen, and I go to Google Images. I always have Google Images up as a tab on my screen, and I type in fat cat, hit enter, and see what comes up. Yes, I got some fat cats, that what I expected, but I also got a slang. The Google interpreted my fat cat as a slang term, as a fat rich person. And it came up with a naked man who was really, really fat with gold chains around his neck. Now, thankfully, he was really fat, so his belly hung over all of his private areas, so we didn't get to see that. But we saw enough of it that I was like, oh my God, I couldn't get it off the screen fast enough. And all the kids laughed. And then I had to go and send out an email to my administrators and then to all my parents, letting them know what happened, because I was embarrassed and I didn't want to get in trouble and just do that. But after that, whenever I was going to go to Google Images and the kids saw me go to the tab, they're like, Profe, cover it up first. So then I learned to take my projector and slide over the cover to block the screen first, so I can do the search, make sure it was all appropriate, and then show it to my kids. So just a word of warning, if you are going to go to Google search and you are actually, even though you have that safety feature search turned on, don't show right away your search results. Same thing with YouTube, a straight Google search, because you never know what's going to come up or what gets snuck in there, and you don't want to show that to kids. It was really funny. And the whole rest of that school year, kids were like, it was just something funny. And they're like, Profe, before you go on to the pictures, cover it up. And it was just kind of a funny thing. So just a word of warning if you're going to do that. But if you're not going to draw, you're going to search for those pictures, whatever way works. But it gives them that visual cue of what's going on so that they can see that they made a mistake without it being pointed out publicly in front of everybody. So those are gestures and visuals and how you can use those. Next, let's talk about echo correction. Now, this is what thing that Susie Gross talked as mom talk or mommy talk. And this is the one that is most naturally implemented by parents. When parents are teaching their kids their native language, this is how they correct them. So what it is, it's a reformulation of what they say. You gently repeat what the student said, but with the correct language form. And this method models the correct usage in a natural, flowing manner. And the kids are used to it because it's how they learn their native language. This is what their parents did for them along the way. And here's an example. So if like a kid goes, me want cookie. Now the parent understood what the kid said, but the parent is also trying to teach them to speak correct language. So instead of pointing out and saying, okay, me is a direct object, and you cannot have that as a subject. So that's wrong. We need to change the me to I. And you can't have a noun without an article. You need either a definite article if you want a specific cookie, I want the cookie, or an indefinite article if you want any cookie, I want a cookie. But you can't say I want cookie. No kid's going to pay attention to that. No kid's going to remember that. And that's probably going to be above the cognitive skills of the baby or the child who's learning the language at that age. But what the parent then does go, oh, you want a cookie. I want a cookie too. So here we did not point out the error. What we did is we rephrased it in the correct form so that over a period of hearing these repetitions, these reformulations, over a period of time, the correct forms will start to emerge. It's the same thing with like irregular verbs. You know, in English, we have what's called strong and weak verbs. Strong are those irregular ones that don't follow patterns, or they follow a whole separate pattern from weak verbs. Weak verbs generally just add ed to the past tense. And then your strong verbs are things like sing, sang, sung, run, ran, ran. So you've got those types of things. So if a kid goes, I goed to the bathroom, the parent is so proud that they went to the bathroom. Like, oh, you went to the bathroom? You went to the bathroom all by yourself? That's awesome. Again, rephrasing. And we're rephrasing because we don't want the kid to feel bad about the language that they're using, so their confidence goes down and that affective filter goes up. We really want to focus on keeping it all positive, and this is one way to do it. And this is the one that I lean more towards in my classroom because I find it comes out more naturally. It's less harsh. There's no preparation. I don't have to go draw on the board. I don't have to go to my computer and do a Google search. It's just natural, and it's the one that the brain is naturally accustomed to because that's how the parents taught them their first language. So it's the least intrusive way. So another example, a student says, yesterday I go to the park. And the teacher goes, yesterday you went to the park. What did you do there? And what always happens to me, I don't know about you, but my kids don't always get the change from the you form to the I form. So if I ask them, what did you watch a movie yesterday? They'll go, yes, you watched a movie yesterday, because they're parroting the exact verb that they heard in the sentence back. And we know that only works in third person. When you go from one third person to the other third person, the verb doesn't change. But from first person to second person or second person to first, it does. So then I'll repeat. I didn't watch a movie yesterday. You watched a movie yesterday, and that helps them correct. But again, it's that parroting and rephrasing back so they can realize that they made an error without me pointing it out and making them all embarrassed. And then I'll go to the board, and then I'll write that verb form on the board. So I'll write it in the question form first, so the you form first, and then underneath it, I'll write that in the I form. I do not write my verbs on the board in chart order. I write them in the order that I use them, but I'll list them in a column. So all of my watch verbs, if I'm using the word watch, all of them will be in the row. And then I'll write you watched in the target language, like miraste. And then I will write next to it equals you watched. And I go mire. And then I will write mire on the board, and I'll put equals, and then I'll write I watched. And then if we get into the third person somehow, miro, I will go ahead and write miro on the board, and then I will write he or she watched. And I put them in the order that they're used. Now, if I'm asking a question with a brand new verb, when I don't expect them to know the forms, again, I will write on the board, but I'll write on the board before I ask the question. So if, let's say, I'm teaching them a brand new verb, let's say, okay, let's go salir, which means to go out. It could also mean is to go out on a date. I will go, saliste ayer? Did you go out yesterday? Or anoche, last night? And so I will write saliste on the board equals you went out. And then right away, before I expect them to answer, I'm going to write sali on the board. I went out. So they have the verb form to make the answer. So I anticipate they're not going to know those verb forms because we haven't gone over that verb yet before. And this way they can just read it off the board and get it correctly in context. And so by doing these kinds of things, this approach subtly corrects that error by modeling the correct past tense without putting the student on the spot, and with me writing on the board that pairs it with a visual. And sometimes if the verb is really concrete, you can go ahead and draw a little picture along the way, especially funny pictures. My kids just love doing those. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or if you're watching on the replay, in the comments below. Next, let's talk about focused feedback. So here, this is where you're going to set aside a dedicated time for reflection. So set aside a specific time for feedback that doesn't interrupt the immediate flow of the communication. This can be at the end of an activity or a class session, and it focuses on common errors in a general way. So we're not pointing it out on any particular student. So let's say I have at least once a week a conversation day where we are talking in the language about some random question, and we're just communicating in the language. I might reserve the last 5 minutes of that class period to then go something like, I noticed we had some trouble with the past tense. So we need to really focus on that. So remember, when you're speaking about things that are happening now, we use the present tense. Here are some examples. And then when we're talking about something that's already happened, then you can, this is how the forms work for that. So you can point it out that way. But you set aside time. You're not taking the time to point it out on any particular error, so nobody's feeling bad in the moment. And then you're talking in a general way and taking it as a teaching moment at the end of an activity. So that works really, really well. And then you can also, you kind of make these middle notes. I'm noticing there's this problem between present and past. So then you can create some mini lessons on these common errors, turning the mistakes into teachable moments for everyone. Now, past versus present is a big one because especially in middle school and even in high school, when I taught high school, even in English, kids have trouble understanding the difference between present and past. I mean, if you ask a high schooler the difference between present and past, they know it. And if you ask them what the past tense of a verb versus a present tense, they know it. But when they're in the flow and they're writing a story or an essay, even in their native language, they often flow back and forth between present and past. They're not really conscious of it. So we can't really fault them in the second language for doing the same thing. We can just help them to be more conscious about it. And that really helps the situation a little bit. But again, we're doing it anonymously. We are taking it out of the actual moment. So using the time after class. Or another thing to do is, you know how like elementary school, every couple of months they'll have like parent conferences where they talk about with every parent in their class about the student. You can set these up with your students. So you might set time, maybe 3 days at the end of a trimester or at the end of a quarter, depending on how your grading period works. And then you set up just, a short 5 to 7 minutes. You don't want it too long and you don't want it too negative, where you can talk to the student one-on-one and give them some feedback about their language that you've noticed over a set period of time. Keep it positive. You definitely want to overwhelm them with the positive things about their language acquisition, but point out a couple of the really big overreaching things that they can do and what they can do to fix those. And keep in mind when you are pointing these out and those overreaching, it's things that hinder comprehension. So I don't usually emphasize gender or adjective endings, even in German, because those kind of things, most of the time, the sentence is still understandable. It's a little bit less so in German because German word order is a little more loosey-goosey than it is in Spanish or French. So you can start a sentence with a direct object in German and put the subject after the verb because of the way that the articles and the endings change depending on how the noun is or pronoun is being used. But I'm not going to really focus on those type of things because it really doesn't hinder communication as much as maybe like verb forms or present versus past. So use those kinds of things, make those mini lessons, have those discussion periods, whether it be whole class at the end of a particular lesson or individually at a regular interval. Like I would do it about 2 or 3 times a year just to give them something to grow on. I don't do it at the end of the year because whatever I tell them at the end of the school year is not going to stick for them by come fall. So I don't worry about that. But I do worry about it from, at the end of my first trimester and at the end of my second trimester so they can try to improve for the upcoming grading periods. My second most used form of error correction is positive reinforcement. And this one is you're just encouraging the correct forms. So instead of pointing out what's wrong, highlight what's right. And this builds that confidence. We've always talked about confidence and how that's important, and makes students more open to participation and by extension, correction. So I started doing this many, many years ago before I even thought about what I was doing. But you know how it's really common practice, especially in a grammar-based class, that on an essay or questions to answers, however it works, that they start marking off like a half a point for small little errors. Oop, you missed an accent mark, minus half. Oh, wrong verb form, minus a half. As long as the main part of the sentence was right and they just had those small little things, they would minus, a half a point or a quarter point or however it worked. But that was focusing on the negative. And what I decided to do was to flip the script on that. So instead, what I did is for all my answers I was looking for a bare minimum answer that was basically correct, that I would accept as a fully correct answer, even though it may have had some errors in it. So my minimum expectation on there, they would get a full point for that. But if they had the correct accent marks, plus half a point. If they had a more complete sentence, plus half a point. So I'm rewarding for more correctness rather than deducting for small errors. And that helped build the confidence of my students. So my students who still made mistakes could still get a relatively good grade because they were able to communicate. They had errors, but the communication was there. And so, with the communication being there, I was able to understand what they wrote, but it wasn't fully correct. But they got their points for that. But then, for those kids who took the extra step to be more correct, they got additional points, which helped boost their overall grade. So, because I was rewarding for the correct forms, that's a really powerful way to do that. Another example of how I did that is I don't usually mark up papers as I'm reading like essays every week. I don't usually mark those up. But what I will do is I will put a smiley face next to a sentence that's particularly good or particularly correct. Instead of marking up their papers with red ink about all the errors that they've made, I've gone ahead and I have put positive strokes, a little smiley face. In fact, the smiley face was actually taking too long. So I don't know if they still make them, but Crayola markers made, they're not really stamps, they're Crayola markers, but instead of having a point on them, they had different shapes. There was a sun, there was a happy face, there was a star, they had a whole bunch, a moon, and they were in different colors. So, the happy face might have been in red, the sun was in orange, the moon was in yellow, etc., etc., etc. You get the idea. So, I had one of those, so all I had to do was just push it down and I would have a smiley face really, really quickly. I didn't use a stamp because a stamp took 2 steps. I would have to stamp the ink pad and then stamp the paper. So it really worked really quickly to put it on there. But kids liked seeing the smiley faces, and they would count up how many smiley faces they got on their papers. And then they would go, I got 4 smiley faces this week. I got 6 smiley faces this week. So it really boosted up their confidence level again. Another example would be, you can say something like, I loved how you used the past tense correctly in that sentence. So if you're doing it like live because they're talking, remember that's how we should talk about things that happened yesterday or last week. And going back to that visual cue, if you want to really help students grasp the tenses, present, past, and future mainly, you can use gestures to assign. So for past tense, we point to the back. So every time I use a past tense verb, I will point to the back of my head. And then I encourage my students to do the same. So when they're talking and they use past tense, they're pointing, so that it makes them a little bit more aware. And then future would be pointing forward, and then present would be pointing straight down because it's right now. You don't have to do that, but it's another thing. It puts a muscle memory to make it a little bit more conscious of what they're doing. And you can also, like I did with the little Crayola marker stamp, you can use stickers, stamps, digital badges for correct usage in spoken or written form. So make it a game to collect them for different grammar points or vocabulary, so they can get extra points, participation points for doing those things, for gathering up these stamps or stickers. Back during COVID, when we went completely digital, I made a whole series of little stamps. I made little graphics with transparent backgrounds. I did that in Canva, and I made a whole bunch of them, and I would just copy and paste them right on the paper. So they turn in a digital paper, maybe a Google Doc, then I will just go ahead and I would just paste them on top of it so they could see right away what was on there. You could also do it in comments. You can highlight the word, put a comment, and then put in a smiley face on there, or an exclamation point if it was really, really good. You can do your own little codes that you want to do. But again, it boosts that confidence level, which is so, so very important. Lastly, let's talk about strategic ignoring. And we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'm going to emphasize it right now. So whenever you're in class, whether it's classroom management or anything that goes on in class, you constantly have to choose your battles. What are you going to die on the hill for? In the case of error correction, not every error needs immediate correction. And I'm so glad that Actful has started to in the past few years to think more about communication over form. That form is important, but more important is communication. So sometimes letting those minor errors slide in that moment keeps the focus on communication. As long as they're communicating and you understand them, then we're good. And think about this in the real world. Let's say you're at the grocery store or at the bank, or you're communicating with someone and English is not their first language and they make some mistakes, but you understood what they were saying. You don't even point out the mistakes. You don't do anything. You just understand it and let it go. But if the mistake was bad enough to where you didn't understand what they said, you generally put the fault on yourself. You go, "Excuse me," or "I'm sorry, can you repeat that?" As if it was your fault. You weren't listening or you didn't hear, and then they repeat it in a different way so you can make communication happen. I know, like with my grandmother, English was not her native language. She learned English when she came over to the United States in her late 20s, early 30s. And she constantly made certain mistakes, and we just kind of accepted them. We understood what she was talking about. And one of the common ones is, just like in Spanish, often they use the verb tomar, to take, as a way of saying drink or to eat. And so, like, you could say, do you drink coffee or do you drink tea? And you can use tomar instead of beber. In the language my grandmother spoke, which is Maltese, they do the same thing. And so she just translated that sentence from Maltese into English. And she will say, are you taking coffee or are you taking water? Or are you taking soda or are you taking water? So we all knew what she meant, but it wasn't the correct word because we don't use that way in English. But there was no point in trying to correct her. There was just the communication happened. So do the same thing in your classroom. So if a student consistently mixes up gender agreement in languages that have that, don't correct every single instant on the spot. Even native speakers make those mistakes with gender. So don't even worry about it if it doesn't affect the overall meaning. Meaning communication still happened, let it go. With more exposure to the language, both written and oral forms, those errors will fix themselves over time. But just note the pattern and address it later with targeted exercise or feedback, like we talked about earlier, that you can go in at the end of a lesson, or you can make a lesson about it to target that feedback. Or in a storytelling session, if a student uses the wrong verb tense, but the message is clear, let it go in the moment. Just bring it up later in a general discussion on verb tenses related to storytelling. Lots of different ways to be able to handle that. But the point is that pick your battles. Don't point out every single error. I try to only focus on the errors that really affect the meaning. And so my biggest ones that I'm pointing out are subject verb errors, because I don't know who's doing the action if they mix those up. Like when I ask my kids, did you go to the movies this weekend? And they go, yes, you went to the movies this weekend. I'm confused now because I didn't go to the movies. I was asking if they went to the movies and they used the wrong subject verb. So I'm confused. So I'm going to fix that one. I didn't go to the movies yesterday. Did you go to the movies yesterday? So I'm rephrasing and formulating for them to make it clear that that's an error that we need to work on, that's important. But if they say la chico, which la is the feminine word for the, and chico is the word for boy, I'm not going to worry about it. I understood. It's really, at German, it gets really complicated because we have 3 genders, and a lot of them don't make sense with the actual gender itself. The pattern of the letters often will override that. For example, yes, the word for woman is a feminine word, the word for man is a masculine word, but the word for girl is a neuter word. It doesn't have anything to do with the gender of the person we're talking about. It has to do with the way the word is written. It uses a diminutive ending, which is CHEN, and it equivalents to the word in English maiden. That N part makes it diminutive and makes it smaller. So that ending always requires the neuter definite article, the neuter the, always. So kids will make the mistake and they'll put the feminine article in front of the word for Mädchen because that's logical. Woman's a feminine, man's masculine, boy is masculine, but girl is neuter, but they don't think of it that way. So they make the mistake. Not a big deal. But I'm going to repattern that and I'm going to say, oh, das Mädchen instead of die Mädchen. So that's how you do that kind of stuff. So what I want to know from you, if you're watching live or if you are watching on the replay, which one of these 5 strategies are you going to focus on mostly in your class? Is it going to be the visual gestures and nonverbal cues? If so, go ahead and put in a 1 in the box. If you are going to really focus on the echo correction, which is my predominant way, go ahead and put a 2 in the box, in the chat or in the comments. If you're really going to do that focus feedback where you take time at the end of the class period or you do a targeted lesson on error corrections, then go ahead and put a 3 in the chat. If you're going to focus on my number 2 method, the positive reinforcement of things that are going on, go ahead and put a 4 in the box. And then if you're going to do strategic ignoring, if that's the one you're going to focus on, put a 5 in the box. So go ahead and do that in the chat or in the comments if you're watching live or replay, so I can kind of see where everybody's at and what you are excited to try in your classroom. If you found this helpful in any way, please go ahead and like this video and subscribe and hit that notification bell to get more notified when we have more in there. James says he uses number 2, but he will add number 4. Awesome. Great. Let us know how that works for you, James. So again, if you are interested in joining us for Beyond the Basics, that mini course, it is starting next week. You can register at, I'll put it back up here on the board, mm.us/beyond. Next week, we're again going to be back on Sunday and see how that works before we change up. I think in June, we may change up to a different day just to see which works best for everybody. But if you are interested, next week, same time, same channel, on Sunday at 3 o'clock Pacific time and 6 p.m. Eastern, we're going to be talking about advanced grammar techniques with your advanced students or even with your lower students, but teaching some advanced grammar and how you can do that. That's our topic for next week. And with that, I wish everybody a good upcoming week. Everybody have a great week, and I hope to see you next Sunday. Have a good one, everybody. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.